Moving on to diagnosis slightly, ADHD diagnosis rates are rising. There seems to be an awful lot of hype on social media about that being as a result of social media, maybe
Oh,
raised
got it.
awareness. Can you what's the truth? Are
Yeah.
ADHD rates rising
Mm.
and why?
Well, what's the truth? That's tricky.
Hmm.
Of course, we only got partial information about all of these things. The truth is something we don't really deal with. I guess what's an approximation of the current evidence? I would say my best guess is that rates aren't rising. It's not implausible that they could be rising because, of course, the brain is a very plastic thing, and the ADHD as a as a heterogeneous but biologically based trait, let's call it, is going to be open to that. So I don't know if the principal investigator of the Romanian adoptee study. So this is where kids experience extreme deprivation. ADHD rates are very high, and we think there's compelling evidence that that's due to their experiences in the orphanages. So the brain is plastic, it is open to vulnerable, and there is crazy stuff going on in the world. Historically speaking, it's a very different place than it was when I was growing up. In the 60s and the 70s. Music's much worse for a start, but apart from that, there's a lot of technology, people online, all day, and so it's not implausible. But I don't think there's any evidence that rates are increasing. The underlying rates are increasing. What has happened, of course, historically, like when I started and when I was first identified as having a hyperkinetic disorder, is 1969 or 1969, 68, 60, I'm not sure, around that time. I think I was 7 or 8. Nobody. There was literally zero prevalence, at least in terms of actual people with a diagnosis. And of course, what has happened is the definition has broadened. And so the big change, of course, was from hyperkinetic disorder, which is very extreme, like 1%, 0.5%, in the population, to ADHD, which is much broader, much less stringent in terms of the criteria, which they reckon about 5%. But it turns out that it's a very flexible thing. So you can have 10 or 20% of kids in some states in America getting a diagnosis of ADHD. So the truth is it's a very flexible definition. And that is because it's based on a subjective reporting of symptoms by mums and dads, by clinicians who are trying to bring a bit of, anchoring to it, but they're relying on the mums and dads or the teacher or even the person themselves, hopefully mentioning, what they're struggling with. So the idea that it's a very tight concept is, I think, misleading. Very flexible, and of course, once it's flexible and people are looking for explanations for why they're suffering, I never dismiss people's suffering. Then that's a kind of an open door to say, I'm struggling to concentrate. Maybe I've got ADHD. Let's look into it a bit deeper. And once you start looking, it's quite a flexible thing. Again, my colleagues would probably disagree with me. They'd say very stringent. We've got the NICE guidelines, but that's not how they're applied.
So is part of what you're saying there that rates may not necessarily be changing, the quantity of people with ADHD may not be changing, but the way it's defined and diagnosed has changed, which has contributed to an increasing number of diagnoses?
I would say that's common to a lot of neurodevelopmental. Autism is the same. I think probably even bigger in autism. It's gone from being a very exclusive condition to being a very broad condition. ADHD's followed that, or also shows that, but maybe not to the extremes as autism, because it was a more common condition than autism, probably in the population, but it now is a very common condition. And I think the diagnostic process is quite flexible. So, for instance, a colleague of mine, I won't mention any names, obviously, she's this person's a psychiatrist for a very famous public school in England, very posh. So she's kind of under pressure to diagnose kids in that very exclusive, get in there like 140 IQ. You know, it's really a really top school. Like, because they're not going to get 5 A stars. That's the impairment for them. So the concept of impairment is ridiculously flexible. You know, so I think that's a massive part of it. And of course, it depends on subjective report. And it is all determined by environmental circumstance.
That subjective report, what role is that playing in misdiagnosis?
I'm not saying misdiagnosis.
Okay.
I think somebody asked me to sign up to a letter recently about underdiagnosis, overdiagnosis or whatever. And I said, well, actually, when you have a pure continuum, it's a meaningless point because there is no natural cutoff that you're trying to match with your diagnostic rate. It's really, where do you want to draw the line? You know, as a society, it used to be much more strict. Now it's much broader. Then, as you know, as a society, and this is a decision not just by docs or by families or by people with ADHD. It's we're defining these culturally. You know, where do we want to draw that line? Do we want to say that 20% of people have got ADHD, or do we want to say that 1% of people have got ADHD? Where do we say impairment becomes intolerable? Now, people may say, well, that's an unanswerable question, and I might agree with them. It's a really tricky one. Certainly when you're on 1%, you're pretty confident. This guy is a total disaster. He can't learn, he can't sit still, he's always in trouble. If you're on 10%, you know, that's 3 people in a classroom. That's a very different sort of thing. So I think, yeah, so I'm raising a conundrum, really, rather than giving an answer, a solution. I wouldn't use the term over or under diagnosis, but I would just describe clearly the rates of people who are looking for explanations, particularly adults and parents, perhaps looking for explanations why their kids are unhappy, struggling, and really having, I mean, genuine. And it's not made up. These are genuine, and these may be to do with cultural and societal issues. And that doesn't mean the rates of ADHD behaviors are going up or down. It just means that they're creating more distress and unhappiness than previously. And that's probably the same anxiety, depression, ADHD, all of these things, you know. So at least that's my view. I mean, it's, as I say, truth is, I'm not sure the word truth applies here, but you know, obviously you can pull together the evidence and come to a interpretation.
What role is social media playing in ADHD at the moment?
Well, at multiple levels. It's funny because we have a research program on this called DIORA, the dynamic interplay of online risk and resilience in adolescents. DIORA. DIORA means gold, so I thought it was a pretty good acronym. I'm good at acronyms, by the way.
Yeah.
This is dyslexia. I think it's my dyslexia.
Is that why you've done so well? Because the field love acronyms.
Well, I hope that's not why I've done so well. I hope there's something better than that.
I think it's evident from your literature that is not why.
I like to have fun when I write, basically, and I like to a little bit whimsical, a little bit lighthearted, not to be too over academic. But yeah, in terms of titles and stuff, I like that. But anyway, sorry, yeah. What did you?
Yeah, the role of social media and ADHD.
ADHD specifically, social media generally is creating risk for anxiety and depression, and the knock-on consequences, just of great unhappiness. In our study, the DIORA study that I just mentioned with colleagues at LSE and Queen Mary, social comparison is the killer engagement that links to anxiety and depression. Risky content, you know, porn or violence, risky interactions, cyberbullying, we actually don't find those as being that strongly linked to anxiety and depression. Driving it, at least over time, it's social comparison. You know, basically, I look at this stuff, it makes me feel ugly, it makes me feel stupid, blah, 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 blah. So that's the risk. That's not specific to ADHD. ADHD people engage in more of it.
Okay.
So it's not like it's creating ADHD, but it's making ADHD people unhappy because obviously because of lack of self-confidence, lack of self-esteem, and all the emotions around struggling to regulate yourself that we're fully aware of. They do engage in looking for this what's the word, validation that they're okay.
So does the evidence suggest that the risk from social comparison is far greater than from harmful stimuli like you mentioned?
Well, yeah. So at least our study, that's what our study suggests.
Yeah.
I mean, and very few studies have looked at it in a systematic way with loads of research, but they're all focused on this thing called screen time. I don't know if you've heard of the concept. Basically, how long you're on screen for, and that's the risk. We showed that's not the case. Screen time does not predict anxiety and depression. It's what you're doing when you're on. And if you're doing social comparison, that over at least an hour study, which is 18-month follow-up, that's what seems to be increasing the risk for anxiety and depression, not the other stuff. Now, I'm not saying the other stuff is good, but I'm talking about anxiety and depression. There may be other reasons. I mean, certainly not good for your soul. I'm sure a lot of it, but that's not anxiety and depression. That wasn't our outcome. Health of soul. I don't think there is a questionnaire on health of soul, but anxiety and depression was our outcome. So for anxiety and depression, social comparison, and it makes total sense because you're constantly looking for validation of yourself.
On social media, the results you've just described, which are somewhat terrifying, pertaining to social interaction, social comparison.
The comparison.
What are the implications of that? Does there need to be policy change to regulate social media use?
That's a great question. I'm not an expert on this. I've come into this area the last 3 or 4 years, really. I'm interested because I've been interested in the potentially harmful effect of environments, and this isn't a potentially harmful environment. But also, let's say another thing is lots of positives in online as well. YouTube, for instance, you've got the whole history of soul music at your fingertips. So that's all great. Obviously, in terms of, for neurodivergent people, it's great. Like all the technology around writing. I never use it because I like writing anyway, but I can see spelling now. I do use that. Some spelling's hopeless, So there's lots of really positive stuff, and also people forming communities and groups. As long as it doesn't stop you forming real groups and communities and not just virtual ones. So there's positive. I don't want to say it's all negative, but certainly in our data, I'm always driven by the data and the science. In our data, it's social comparison is what's driving over time. They call it cross-lagged effect from time 1 to time 2. Social media drives anxiety and depression. It was also possible, of course, that depression and anxiety drive social media as well in terms of social comparison. The more depressed you are, the more you're looking for validation. But we don't find that, at least in our study at the moment. We're going to follow it up and go into the future more in terms of follows, in terms of like 2 years, 3 years down the line. So I would say, but I think the risk for ADHD is that they just do more of it. I think, that's our preliminary analysis, not published that yet, but our preliminary is that they do more of the bad stuff.
Spend more time on social media,
Spend
do more
time
social comparison.
looking for social comparison, yeah.